The story begins with legendary hunter Glass deep inside the unforgiving wilderness. Without warning, a gigantic grizzly bear suddenly charges straight at him. Glass desperately fires his rifle, but the massive beast refuses to stop. Within seconds, the bear violently tears into his body, ripping his back apart and leaving him covered in blood. Knowing this is a fight he can't escape, Glass grabs his hunting knife and desperately fights back, stabbing the beast again and again. After a brutal struggle, the grizzly finally collapses, dying on top of him. By the time the other hunters arrive, Glass is barely breathing. They quickly pull the dead bear away and try to save him. But the moment they see his injuries, everyone realizes he shouldn't have survived. The hunters did everything they could to keep Glass alive. Using the little medical supplies they had, they treated his wounds as best they could. But there was one huge problem. They were deep inside a dangerous wilderness, with a Native American war party still hunting them down. Knowing they couldn't leave one of their own behind, the group built a fire to keep Glass warm through the freezing night. At first light, they continued their journey, carrying his badly broken body on a wooden stretcher. No matter how difficult the path became, they refused to abandon him. But dragging Glass through the mountains quickly became impossible. As the group struggled up a steep hill, John Fitzgerald suddenly suggested they should stop risking everyone's lives and leave the dying hunter behind. Captain Henry refused immediately. Instead, he offered $70 to anyone willing to stay with Glass until his final breath before giving him a proper burial. Without hesitation, Glass's son Hawk stepped forward. The young trapper Jim Bridger also agreed. And despite clearly hating Glass, Fitzgerald accepted too. Not out of loyalty, but for the money. That night, Hawk never left his father's side. Despite Glass barely being able to move, his son stayed beside him, hoping his father would somehow survive until morning. When daylight finally arrived, Hawk headed to the nearby river, hoping to catch some fish for his injured father. Seeing the opportunity, Fitzgerald secretly dug a shallow grave before convincing Bridger to fetch water from the stream, leaving him alone with the helpless Glass. The moment Bridger disappeared, Fitzgerald slowly walked toward Glass and whispered that he could end all of his suffering. All Glass had to do was blink. Unable to speak because of his terrible injuries, Glass slowly father. Enraged, Fitzgerald pulled out his knife and stabbed Hawk straight through the chest. Glass could do nothing. He was forced to watch his own son die right before his eyes. To hide what he had done, Fitzgerald dragged Hawk's lifeless body deep into the forest and hid it where nobody would find it. When Bridger finally returned from the stream, he immediately asked where Hawk had gone. Fitzgerald calmly lied, claiming Hawk had wandered off and that he had no idea where he was. As night began to fall, Fitzgerald suddenly woke Bridger in panic. He pointed toward the hill and claimed a group of Native American hunters were getting closer every second. Terrified, Bridger immediately prepared to run. Then he asked the question that had been bothering him. What about Glass? Fitzgerald coldly replied that Glass would never survive his injuries anyway. Pretending to give him a proper burial, he dragged the helpless Glass into the shallow grave he had dug earlier and covered half of his body with dirt, leaving him buried alive. Believing there was nothing else he could do, Bridger quietly placed a bottle of water beside Glass. With tears in his eyes, he apologized for abandoning him, then turned around and ran for his own life. Moments later, Glass was left alone in the freezing wilderness, buried alive and left to die. Glass refused to give up. Using every bit of strength he had left, he painfully dragged himself out of the shallow grave. Every movement felt like torture. Ignoring the freezing cold, he crawled toward the place where Fitzgerald had hidden Hawk's body. Moments later, he found his son lying lifeless in the snow. Glass collapsed beside him, completely broken. Meanwhile, Bridger couldn't stop thinking about what they had done. Overcome with guilt, he confronted Fitzgerald, demanding to know if he had really seen the Native American hunters. Instead of answering, Fitzgerald pulled out his gun and pointed it directly at Bridger. He warned him to never question him again, making it clear that if Bridger didn't like what happened, he could leave. Terrified, Bridger stayed silent. Fitzgerald grabbed both rifles and continued their journey as if nothing had happened. Back in the wilderness, Glass knew lying beside Hawk meant certain death. Summoning every ounce of strength left inside him, he covered himself with the bare skin and began crawling through the frozen forest. Every inch forward was agony. Starving and badly wounded, he survived by eating whatever he could find, even the remains at the campsite. After discovering fresh tracks, they immediately began following the trail. Luckily for Glass, he had already crawled far enough to avoid them. Reaching a nearby stream, he drank desperately before using fire to burn and seal his terrible wounds. The pain was unbearable, but he knew it was the only way to stay alive. As another freezing night passed, Glass forced himself to stand. His legs immediately gave out beneath him. Still, he refused to surrender. Moments later, he suddenly heard voices echoing from the hill above. Looking up, he spotted the Native American hunters searching the area. Glass quickly hid behind a large rock, but he knew it wouldn't protect him for long. With no other choice, he slowly slipped into the freezing river beside him. Just then, one of the hunters spotted him and instantly opened fire. Arrows flew toward him from every direction. Luckily, the powerful river current swept Glass away before they could reach him, carrying him far downstream and saving his life once again. Exhausted, he dragged himself onto the riverbank, barely able to breathe. Meanwhile, Fitzgerald and Bridger continued their journey back to the main hunting camp, believing Glass had already died. Back in the wilderness, Glass refused to stop moving. Starving and freezing, he tried fishing along the river. For the first time in weeks, he finally caught a fish. Without waiting to cook it, he ate it raw just to stay alive. After regaining a little strength, Glass continued wandering through the endless forest, desperately trying to find his way back. That devoured it within seconds. For the first time in days, his stomach was finally full. The warmth of the fire and the food overwhelmed his exhausted body, and he quietly drifted to sleep. The next morning, the Native American hunter gently woke Glass. After seeing the terrible wounds covering his body, Glass explained that he had been brutally attacked by a giant bear. The hunter carefully examined the injuries and immediately realized Glass was telling the truth. Without saying a word, he helped the wounded Hun. Henry immediately demanded to know what had happened. Without showing a trace of guilt, Fitzgerald lied that Glass had been given a proper burial and that Hawk had mysteriously disappeared. Believing the story, Captain Henry went inside, collected the promised reward, and handed Fitzgerald his share of the money. Bridger couldn't even look at it. The guilt of abandoning Glass was slowly destroying him from the inside. Back in the wilderness, Glass continued traveling with his new companion. Then suddenly, a freezing snowstorm swept across the forest. Already weakened by his injuries, Glass collapsed into the snow. Seeing his condition, the Native American hunter immediately gathered wood, built a small shelter, lit a fire, and carefully dragged Glass inside. He then treated the deep wounds across Glass's back with traditional medicine, refusing to leave him behind. For the first time since the brutal bear attack, Glass was no longer fighting to survive alone. As daylight broke over the frozen wilderness, Glass stepped outside the small shelter. But the Native American hunter who had saved his life was nowhere to be found. Thinking his friend had only gone hunting, Glass wrapped himself tightly in the bear's skin and slowly wandered through the icy forest searching for him. Moments later, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. His only friend was hanging lifeless from a tree. Glass instantly realized that enemies had already passed through the area. Without making a sound, he hid beneath a tree and waited patiently until evening. As darkness covered the forest, he spotted the Native American warriors gathered around a fire, eating and celebrating. Knowing this was his only chance, Glass quietly sneaked toward the horses, hoping to steal one and escape. But before he could leave, he witnessed something horrifying. One of the warriors was violently assaulting a young Native American woman he had captured. Without thinking twice, Glass quietly came up behind him, held him at gunpoint, and forced him away from the terrified girl. The young woman immediately ran into the darkness while Glass grabbed his entire camp erupted into chaos. Meanwhile, the rescued young woman escaped in a different direction, while Glass disappeared deep into the wilderness. The next morning, Glass woke up to another deadly attack. The Native American warriors had found him again. He fired back just long enough to create an opening before jumping onto his horse and racing through the frozen wilderness. But suddenly, the frightened horse leaped straight into a deep valley. Both of them crashed violently to the ground. Moments later, Glass regained consciousness and discovered the horse was dead. The freezing night was closing in fast. With nowhere to hide and no way to survive the cold, he made a horrifying decision. Glass ripped open the horse's stomach, pulled out its intestines, removed his clothes, and crawled inside the carcass, using its warmth to survive the freezing night. The next morning, he climbed out, put his clothes back on, and continued wandering through the endless wilderness. Meanwhile, back at the hunting camp, One of the Native American prisoners who had escaped arrived and reported that someone had attacked their camp during the night. The only clue he found was a water bottle left behind. The moment Bridger saw it, his heart sank. He instantly recognized it as Glass's bottle. At the same time, Fitzgerald realized exactly what it meant. Glass was still alive. Without wasting another second, Captain Henry ordered his men to ride out immediately and search the place where the bottle had been found, believing they might finally discover who had left it there. As darkness fell, Captain Henry and his men continued searching the area where the bottle had been found. Then suddenly, they spotted a man slowly walking through the frozen wilderness. To their shock, it was Glass. Without wasting another second, they rushed over and carried him back to the hunting camp. The moment Captain Henry arrived, he angrily searched everywhere for Fitzgerald. But Fitzgerald was already gone. Realizing something was terribly wrong, Captain Henry immediately ordered Bridger to be arrested. Bridger tried desperately to explain, but the soldiers dragged him away. Moments later, Captain Henry met Glass alone. Glass explained that Bridger was innocent. It was Fitzgerald who murdered his son, Hawk, convinced Bridger to leave with him, and buried Glass alive in a shallow grave, leaving him there to die. Glass then made one request. He wanted a horse and a gun. He was going to hunt down the man who killed his son. Without saying another word, Captain Henry saddled his horse, and together, the two men rode out to track down Fitzgerald. As they rode deeper into the frozen wilderness, Captain Henry and Glass decided to split up so they could find Fitzgerald faster. Moments later, Fitzgerald suddenly stepped out from his hiding place and opened fire. The gunshot echoed through the forest. Hearing it, Glass immediately followed the sound. But by the time he arrived, Captain Henry was already dead. He quickly spotted Fitzgerald running through the woods and chased after him. The two exchanged gunfire while sprinting through the forest. After running for several minutes, Fitzgerald became exhausted. Knowing Glass would never stop chasing him, he turned around and faced him. He told Glass that no matter what he did, he could never bring his son back. The two immediately engaged in a brutal hand-to-hand fight, using knives and anything they could grab. After a fierce struggle, Glass overpowered Fitzgerald and used the very knife Fitzgerald had used to kill Hawk to stab him in the stomach. Glass then pushed Fitzgerald's body into the river, sending him directly toward the Native American warriors. The Native Americans immediately grabbed Fitzgerald and finished him. As they passed by Glass, they didn't harm him, because Glass had once rescued their daughter. At last, Glass got his revenge. And that's where the movie comes to an end. If you enjoyed this recap, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for more incredible survival stories.